Welcome to Nobody Told Me. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
As a mother-daughter duo, we've very much been looking forward to our interview with Marisa Bardach Ramel. She's our guest on this episode. Marisa and her mother, Sally, wrote a book together. It's an honest, heartfelt, touching glimpse into the relationship between a mother and a daughter when the mother is diagnosed with terminal cancer.
The book is called The Goodbye Diaries, and in it, Marisa and her mother write alternating chapters voicing their individual fears, frustrations, and connection to each other. The Goodbye Diaries offers an eye-opening look into both sides of a terminal diagnosis, the one who will leave and the one who will be left behind. Marisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. When I heard about your podcast, I couldn't think of two people who would understand this book more than a mother and daughter who are obviously so close and connected and working on this creative project together like you guys. So I'm just thrilled to be talking with you.
Tell us more about how the Goodbye Diaries came about originally.
So my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer when I was a senior in high school, and she was originally given 2 months to live, and thankfully she outlived that prognosis. And in the fall of that year, this was in 2000, I went away to Syracuse University, and my mom used to like to call me at midnight because she knew I was around and she knew we could chat. And so other friends were getting calls from boys who liked them, and I was getting calls from my mother. And in one of those conversations, she called me Missy as my nickname, and she said, Missy, everyone's telling me to write a book. I don't think I can do it, but what if we wrote one together? And I was at Syracuse University studying journalism, and I immediately loved this idea. And so the next time I was home on break, we sat on my double bed in my childhood room, and my mom took out a notebook and we started mapping out what we wanted to write about, different chapters we thought would be in the book. And we thought, okay, there'll be a chapter about the night that she was diagnosed. There'll be a chapter about how our friendships changed after she was diagnosed. There would be a chapter about this big fight that we had shortly after she found out she was sick. And she wanted to write about how her marriage had changed. And then we said, we're going through the same thing, but we're going through it in two totally different ways. She was in her 50s, a mother with 2 teenage children, and she was the patient, obviously. And I was a 17-year-old girl very much in my own world of those 17-year-old worries, like going to prom and graduating high school and where am I going to go to college and making new friends in college. And we were just in two totally different places in our lives. And yet we both had to grapple with this illness. So we both set off to write our chapters. And the first chapter we wrote about was her diagnosis. And we each wrote our chapters. And the next time I was home on break from school, we swapped chapters. This was back old school when we had typed it out. It wasn't that old school, but we, printed it out and then exchanged it in person.
Uh-huh.
And I just remember that experience so well of reading her chapter while she was reading my chapter. And it was just so eye-opening how different our experiences were. And I remember especially my mom was very funny and very sarcastic. And she was reading my chapter and she burst out at one point I always knew you thought I was just being a hypochondriac. And so, there were moments of humor of reading each other's chapters. And there were moments of clarity of really feeling oh my gosh, I never really thought about what that evening that my mom was diagnosed. I never really thought about what that was like for her. I thought so much about what that was like for me once she came home and told us. But I didn't really think about what that was like for her at the doctor's office, driving home from the doctor's office with my father, preparing for how they were going to tell me and my brother. Those were things that I just couldn't really think about as a 17-year-old. I think you're not quite developed yet at that age.
So working on this journaling project with your mother after her terminal diagnosis must have helped each of you understand more about what the other was going through in a way that probably most families dealing with something like this don't do.
Yeah, I think for us, my mom and I were always drawn to writing, and that was really how each of us processed. And we had never done something like this before where we were each writing and both processing individually that way, and then also by exchanging the chapters processing our grief together. Because I think there is a lot of grief when someone is diagnosed, even though they haven't died yet. Usually think of grief in that way, but there's so much of, what I learned they call anticipatory grief, where you're walking around with this deep level of anxiety every day, wondering, is she going to die today? I mean, you just have this unknown amount of time with terminal illness. And for my mom and I, we were always very close when I was growing up. And when she was diagnosed, I really turned away from her. The doctor told her she had 2 months to live. And I just said, if she's going to die in 2 months, why am I spending 2 months being best friends with her? I just sort of killed her off in my head, and I stopped going upstairs to her room and talking to her. I really just acted like she was already gone, I think as a protective mode. And so the book really became something that helped us come back together. We had this really big blowout fight when I was a senior in high school still, and that was sort of a breaking point for us that really became a catalyst where after that, we slowly found our way back together. And the book is a big way of how we did that with each other, because we weren't always comfortable talking to each other. She would have been comfortable talking to me. I just wasn't comfortable talking to her, which is, the typical teenage daughter and mother.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know how you came to the decision that you could be there for her emotionally and try and continue to grow your relationship with her, even though you knew that your time with her was going to be limited.
It was really hard. I honestly, for a long time, didn't know if I could be there for her. There's a moment in the book and in our lives where we have this big blowout fight, and she says to me, Missy, I just need to know if you're going to be there for me or not. Because she was obviously so hurt by me not being there for her. It was just so unexpected of what our relationship had been.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to her, I remember it so clearly. I said, I thought about it for a long time. Can I really be there for her? Can I really come home from high school every day and go upstairs to her room and say, hi, Mom, how are you feeling? It felt very false to me. And I said to her that night, I said, I don't know if I can be. And I thought it would feel good to say that because it was the truth, but it made me feel like a really bad daughter. And I didn't really know how to get out of that mode. And I really think going away to college helped us come back together. I think that happens for so many mothers and daughters, where all of a sudden you have some space from each other and you say, oh my gosh, I miss her now, and I think both people feel that way in the relationship. The mom feels it and the daughter feels it. And having that distance, not living in the same house, being 5 hours away from each other, all of a sudden having to rely on these midnight phone calls, and just feeling like I had this separate life from her, and she started treating me more like a grown-up. All those things that every mother and daughter really go through in that time, for us, meant even more just because we had separated so much leading up to me leaving for college. And so that became a time where we were able to slowly reconnect. And it was definitely a very gradual reconnection. It wasn't overnight.
What did your mother hope to accomplish by working on this journaling project with you? What do you think her agenda was, or her motive behind wanting to do this with you?
It's so interesting to think about that now, because obviously I don't have her perspective on it now. If you're interviewing her, I don't know if she would say, oh, it was really just a scam to get Missy to start talking to me again. What was going on?
Whatever works.
But I really think it wasn't that. I really think it came from this very sincere place of wanting to process her own grief of what she was going through, wanting to better understand what I was going through. And she also had in mind, I think, some kind of legacy that she was leaving behind. We always talked about this other mother and daughter that might read this book, and maybe they're in the same situation where the mother has cancer, or maybe no one is ill, but maybe it's a teenage daughter and her mom, and they have a lot of tension in their relationship, or something has interfered with their relationship and they're trying to find their way back together. Or maybe it's just a regular mother-daughter who have a great relationship, but want to kind of appreciate it by reading about another mother and daughter and how they came through adversity. So we always talked about this other mother and daughter. It almost became these fictional characters. Maybe one day read our book. And I think that comforted both of us, that maybe there was a purpose to what we were going through, or maybe there was something worthwhile that we could leave behind for someone else.
You and your mom talked really openly about the relationships that you had going on in your life at that point. And obviously, since you were a teenager, most of these were turbulent relationships. And I love how she wrote, "If only Missy would believe in herself, know how special she is, that she deserves the very best both in guys and in life. But I suppose that sort of wisdom only comes with age." And I guess that hit me so much because my mom has said similar things to me over the years. And I'm wondering, reading that back now, how does that hit you differently than it did when you read it all the way back in 2000?
Oh my gosh. I just think, thank God I married my husband for the gem he is, and how much my mom would be so happy that I did eventually find someone worthy of me. And I mean, he even designed our beautiful book cover. He's he's been like my secret partner in crime in this book. You know, he never had the chance to know my mom, but he's played such a part in the book coming to life just by supporting me. But I just remember from the time I was a young girl, and maybe it's being a child of the 80s where we had too much of that princess culture and wanting to know who this Prince Charming was going to be. But I was just dying to know who I was going to end up with. Mm-hmm. And I think especially once my mom got sick, I wanted that solidified so badly for so many reasons. I wanted that support. I wanted that love. I wanted that person to have known my mom. I was so scared that I would end up with someone who, in my mind, felt like a stranger. Like, if they never knew my mom, how would they ever really know me? And, you know, it's obvious in the book to the reader, not to Marisa, but it's obvious to the reader that, like, none of these guys are really, you know, hitting the mark. Right. Right. Which is a bad pun unintentionally because my husband's name is Mark. But, you know, I think it's also, that's very typical of teenage relationships and relationships in your 20s.
And your mom could see that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, she had a real good bullshit radar. Or I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on the show.
Sure. Go ahead.
You know, she was opinionated and she didn't hold back on what she thought about people. And, you know, you see over and over again in the book, she's trying to say what she thinks is like an open way of saying something of like, maybe you'll meet other people in college, you know, and at the time I'm going,
softening the blow.
You know, right. And it's doing the same thing it does to every teenage daughter, where then you just dig your heels in more into that terrible relationship you're in. You know, but eventually I do meet someone else in college, and I think I've met someone who really can support me and is so tender towards what I'm going through. And, you know, it turns out he has a lot of his own issues he's grappling with. And my mother ends up being the one who helped support me when I decide to leave that relationship. And it really becomes one of the most defining things she does during that period of her illness.
Your mother passed away in 2002. Why did it take so long to get the Goodbye Diaries published?
I ask myself that every day. I think so many things only make sense in hindsight. I'm still waiting for those like hindsight goggles that you can just buy and understand things sooner. I began working on this book when I was 18. I'm now 36. Obviously, so much has changed in that time. I'm married. I have 2 young children now. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. My life looks so different than it did when I started the book, and in some ways that makes the time that has passed feel even longer. Mm-hmm. I really thought this would be a book that came out in my early 20s, shortly after my mom died. My mom died when I was 20, and I thought, all right, I'll just put together her chapters and write my chapters. And I was working as an editor at various magazines, and I thought, great, I'll just do this project. And it was almost like putting together a collage, because when my mom died, I was left with chapters that she had written. I was left with journals that she had kept, medical notebooks that she had kept, letters that she had written to me and my dad and my brother. even just like Post-its where she had jotted down notes. And then I had some of my chapters written, but really not that many because I was in college at the time. So I couldn't really find that much time to write my chapters. Luckily, I kept copious journals. I wrote every day when I was in college. And thank God, because later, so many of my chapters are just verbatim from my journals at the time. And I was able to feel like I really remembered accurately what I felt in those years. And then I had to figure out how to piece it all together to form a book and a narrative. And was it going to work to tell this story in these alternating chapters? And I wrote probably a third of the book in my early to mid-20s. And then I moved in with my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband. And I just thought, maybe I'm in this happy period of my life now, and I should just be happy. And like going back to this book feels like something sad. And maybe that was just something cathartic, and that's all it was. And that's all it was meant to be. I didn't really understand how to be both at once. How do I be this happy person who's in this really solid, healthy relationship and also be this girl who's still grieving her mom? And I put the book down for about 4 years, and my husband and I got married. And about a year after we got married, I said to my husband, I'd like to try to start having a baby. And he said, I'm not really ready to do that quite yet. And I said, all right. I said, well, then I think maybe I'm going to finish that book. I mean, thank God my husband didn't want to just start having a bunch of kids because
it wouldn't have gotten written.
Yeah, really. In that next year, I put together the remaining 2/3 of the book. It was just a time in my life where I could do it in a very clear-eyed, passionate, exciting kind of way. I was so enjoying working on it for the first time. It didn't feel as painful. Maybe more time had passed. Maybe it was that I was now in this relationship where I could go into this little room in our apartment that we had set up as a writing studio, and I could be in there and be totally in that mode and really feel like I went back in time and sort of like spent time with my mom and reread her journals and reread my own and figured out how to craft this book. And then I could open the door and walk down the hallway and see my husband, who was, when you're in that newlywed stage, it's so exciting to go see your husband and have a cocktail and hang out and feel like I could go to that world with my mom and then I could re-enter my current world and it wasn't as jarring. And I think some of that helped me figure out in general in my life how to be both of those people.
In what ways do you think that losing your mother to cancer and having this slow, long goodbye was different than if she died suddenly?
I think about that a lot, and I reflect on that in the book because something that happens while she's sick is 9/11. And what scenario makes that more clear? I was at Syracuse University at the time. I was a sophomore, and I just remember after the towers fell, just sitting on the quad and watching so many people, on their cell phones crying, and you don't know who is just scared or who has lost someone. And I just saw, oh my gosh, so many people today are going to lose someone in an instant. What is that like compared to, the way I might lose my mom? I think it's peculiar, but there's something in me that was always searching of like, would losing someone in an instant be better somehow? Would it be less awful? Of course, the answer is no, but I think you're trying to find anything that might make your situation less awful than it is, because the truth of it being so awful was just really hard to swallow. I think for my mom and I, the extra time we had together was very healing for us. I think being an older teenager like I was 17 and I was sort of on this precipice of becoming an adult, and she died when I was 20. I think like any age that you lose your mom is horrible, but I think there's so much change that goes on from leaving high school and going to college. And I'm so grateful that I had my mom's wisdom in that time. And I'm grateful that we were able to revive our friendship, because that was always a huge part of my identity, is I had this mom who, like all of my teenage friends, kind of wished their moms were more like my mom. She was just that person who, like, my friends would come over, my mom would come, like, sit on the bed with us and, like, hang out. And, then finally I'd be like, Ma, go away. But, she, like, my dad used to joke that she had, like, a talk to me sign on her head. Everyone just wanted to talk to my mom and be around her. And she was funny and she was a good listener. And I loved being her daughter. And I loved being her, like, partner in crime. I loved that she was, like, loud and outgoing and would say whatever she wanted. And I was quieter and more of an introvert. So it was so comfortable to be around her. And now I think I've sort of taken on some of her personality characteristics. And now I am a lot more outgoing. And I still think I would like to say more of whatever I want. I picture myself like as an old lady, maybe finally getting comfortable with that.
What suggestions would you have for teenagers who have a parent with a terminal illness? And what suggestions would you have for a parent with a terminal illness who has a teenager in terms of coping with this?
Yeah, I mean, my advice for teenagers coping with a loss or with a parent who's ill is just to really find what works for you. I think no one processes that information in the same way. As a teenager, you're just looking for that guidebook of, like, how do I do this? What am I supposed to do? What's normal to feel? What's not normal to feel? And I think you need to find the things that work for you. Like for me, it was writing in a journal. It was talking to my one best friend, but not really talking to any of my other friends about what was going on. I think you don't really know what's going to feel good for you and what's going to make you feel better. And that's okay. I decided as a teenager to really keep my mom's illness a secret from my high school and from a lot of my friends. I wanted so badly just to be normal and to not have this abnormal feeling thing in my life. And I kind of wanted to pretend it didn't exist. And in hindsight, I really wish I had reached out to more friends. I really wish I had told maybe at least like one teacher in my school so that I had that support. But I also understand that that's a very normal teenage reaction. And I think it's okay, if there are teenagers out there dealing with it and you're not that comfortable talking about it with everyone, just find like one or two people who you are, but make sure you have at least that in place. And for a mother going through a terminal illness who has teenagers, it's really hard. I think my mom was in such a hard situation because she wanted so badly to give me time and to let me come back to her in my own time. But she also had no idea how much time she had left and whether if she just let me have enough time, would she regret that because maybe she wouldn't have enough time for that to happen. So I think mothers are in a hard place with that. And I think the more allowances you can give to your teenager in terms of, okay, maybe they're not talking to you, but, maybe you kind of sense or overhear that they're talking to their best friend at night on the phone, or it's harder now. It's even harder than it was when I was a teenager because now they're just texting. And so you don't really know who they're confiding in. So I think that makes things more challenging. But I think trying to give teenagers room to open up to whoever they feel comfortable opening up to and accepting the fact that like it might not be you who they're opening up to, but as long as it's someone, I think eventually the more comfortable they feel talking to at least one person, the more comfortable they might feel starting to come back to you.
And what is your nobody told me lesson? So what do you wish that somebody had told you about loss, relationships, being a daughter or being a mother that you wish that they had?
I don't know if I would have believed it at the time. Nobody told me that I would go from being motherless to motherful. And I spent so many years really feeling the pain of being a motherless daughter. And it feels now like overnight that changed. My father got remarried and I now have a stepmother. I got married and I actually have two mother-in-laws because my husband has a mother and a stepmother. All of my aunts rose to the position of second mom after my mom died in this wonderful, supportive way. And even my friends and my cousins became sort of like mini mothers to me. I think people fill in those gaps in this very natural way that's just so loving and tender and caring. And now I'm a mother myself, and I have a 3-year-old son and an almost 1-year-old daughter. And, all of a sudden Mother's Day is not the holiday it once was for me. I mean, I used to dread Mother's Day, and now I get to celebrate it again. And yes, I think of my mom that day, but it's not really a sad day for me anymore. There are certainly moments of sadness. I think part of me will always be that motherless daughter, but I'm very lucky. I know I'm lucky that I have all of these other mothers surrounding me, and now I have these 2 beautiful children surrounding me, and I feel especially lucky to have a daughter and to feel like that mother-daughter relationship is back in my life. And I don't know if I would have even believed it if someone had told me how motherful life could be.
What do you think your mother would say to you now that the book has been published?
Oh my gosh, I really debate on this one because, like so many people, like everyone really, my mom had so many different sides to her personality. She had this really understanding, heartfelt way about her. And I think that side of her would say, oh my gosh, look at what Missy did. She spent all these years working on this book. And of course she did, because that's who Missy is. She's so loyal and loving and determined. And in that sense, she wouldn't be surprised that I just kept at this project. And then she also had this very funny, sarcastic side. And I've really been hearing her voice say, oh my God, Missy, you worked on that project for all these years. I think she had no expectation that I would complete it. I never felt pressure from her. But I did feel like, oh my gosh, how cool would it be if I was able to make my mom an author all these years after she died? I bet she never thought she would write a book and be the author of a book. And I love that she can still become something, nearly 17 years after she died. It speaks to the legacy that so many people can leave.
You just did such a beautiful job putting this book together. And I think you did such a wonderful thing for your mother and for yourself, because you'll always have this and your kids will have this. And luckily enough, we all get to share it with you and get to learn about who she was. How can people learn about the book if they're not familiar with it? Because everybody should read it.
Oh, thank you so much. And really, truly thank you for having me on. I really could think of no better fit than the 2 of you. And talking to both of you just reminds me of how wonderful and awesome the mother-daughter bond is. People can learn more about the book by going to goodbyediaries.com. And the book is available on Amazon and barnesandnoble.com and other online retailers. And they can also follow me. I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and all those links are on goodbyediaries.com.
All right, great. We thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Our thanks to Marisa Bardach Ramel, who along with her mother, Sally Bardach, co-authored the new book, The Goodbye Diaries, a mother-daughter memoir. I'm Jan Black.
And I'm Laura Owens.
You're listening to Nobody Told Me. Thank you so much for joining us.